In more than 30 years on this bench, I have heard every kind of threat a human being is capable of making. But I never once imagined that a United States Senator would walk into my courtroom, call me by my first name, and inform me calmly, pleasantly, as though it was simply a matter of scheduling, that my career was something he could end with a single phone call. That morning didn't just test my patience. It tested the very foundation of what this bench is built to protect. If you believe, as I do, as I have always believed, that the law applies to everyone equally, whether you're selling homemade preserves at a Saturday market or writing legislation on Capitol Hill, then you need to hear every word of this story. I'd be glad to have you subscribe, because what came next is something I will never forget, and neither will you. It was a sharp Monday morning in November, the kind of cold that gets into the building before you do. I walked into my courtroom at 8:50 a.m., coffee in hand, expecting the usual organized chaos. People talking quietly to their lawyers, families pressing together in the gallery rows, the low hum of a room full of people with problems they're hoping someone can help them solve. But today the room was wrong, completely, unnervingly silent. The kind of silence that tells you something has already happened before you arrived. I looked at my clerk, Michael. He was standing rather than sitting, which he never does, and his face was the color of chalk. He didn't say good morning. He didn't hand me anything. He simply looked toward the gallery and said very quietly, "Judge, front row." I put on my glasses and looked up. Sitting in the public gallery, right where ordinary people sit, right where families and witnesses and court watchers sit, was a man in a dark navy suit that had not been purchased anywhere in this city. On his lapel, an American flag pin. Behind him, 2 aides and a personal attorney arranged like furniture. He was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided how the morning ends. He was looking at my bench like a man who had come to collect something that belonged to him. Senator Victor Caldwell, 3 terms in office, presidential ambitions, the kind of political weight that makes staffers lower their voices when his name comes up. I looked down at the docket. The name on the file read Natalie Caldwell, age 26, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, fleeing the scene of an accident, his daughter. What he didn't know, what he was about to find out, was that he had walked into the wrong courtroom. I struck the gavel and called the session to order. The bailiff announced the case. I looked toward the prosecutor's table, ready to begin. Senator Caldwell stood up. He didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask to be recognized. He didn't do any of the things that every other person in that room understood were required of them the moment they walked through those doors. He simply stood, buttoned his jacket with the unhurried ease of a man adjusting before a board meeting, and walked through the swinging gate into the well of my courtroom. The space that belongs to attorneys, defendants, and officers of the court, and to no one else without my permission. My bailiff took a step forward. I held up one finger. I wanted to hear this. The senator stopped in front of my bench and looked up at me with a smile I can only describe as patient. The smile of someone who was accustomed to people understanding things without needing to be told twice. He clasped his hands in front of him. "Your Honor," he said, except the way he said it made it sound like anything but. The words were technically correct. The tone carried none of the weight they were meant to hold. It came out the way you'd address a colleague you've decided is junior to you, polite on the surface, dismissive underneath. The kind of courtesy that is really just condescension wearing a tie. "This case," he said, "is a politically motivated mischaracterization of a minor traffic incident involving my daughter. I think we both know that. I sit on the Federal Judiciary Oversight Committee, and I have a genuine interest in seeing that the resources of this court are directed toward matters that actually warrant them." He paused. The smile didn't move. "I would simply encourage you to consider the implications of how this morning proceeds for everyone involved." He said it calmly, pleasantly, the way you'd recommend a restaurant. No raised voice, no pointed finger, not yet. Just the smooth, quiet pressure of a man who has spent 3 terms in office, learning that the most effective threats are the ones that don't sound like threats at all. I took my glasses off. I set them on the bench in front of me, deliberately, the way I do when I need my eyes clear and my hands free, and every person in the room to understand that what comes next will not be negotiated. The gallery did not make a sound, not one. "Senator," I said. My voice was level, final, not interested in discussion. "Return behind the bar, or I will have you removed." He held my gaze for a moment longer than was wise. Then he turned and walked back to the front row, with the deliberate calm of a man who had decided to try a different approach. He sat down. He crossed one leg over the other. He was not finished, but neither was I. I turned to the prosecutor's table. "Mr. Webb, please proceed." Marcus Webb stood up. I will tell you plainly, the young man looked like he was holding himself together through sheer force of professional obligation. He was 28 years old, 8 months into his first prosecutorial position. He had prepared for this case. He had not prepared for the senator. And the difference between those two things was written across his face in a way that everyone in that gallery could read. His hands were not entirely steady as he held his notes, but he stood up. That matters. He stood up anyway. "Your Honor," he began, his voice finding its footing as he went. "On Saturday, November 9th, at approximately 11:20 in the morning, the defendant, Natalie Caldwell, drove a 2023 Range Rover into the pedestrian zone of the city's weekly farmers market on Clement Street. She was traveling at a speed estimated by 2 independent witnesses at between 35 and 40 miles per hour in a zone where no vehicle traffic is permitted." He paused. 4 people were injured. 1 required hospitalization for a broken wrist. 2 others sustained lacerations. The 4th was Dorothy Okafor. I looked toward the gallery. Dorothy was sitting in the 3rd row. Her arm was in a sling. Her cheek still carried the faint, yellowed shadow of a fracture that had not fully resolved. She was sitting completely straight. She was watching Marcus Webb with the patient attention of someone who has waited a long time for her name to be said in a room like this. "Miss Okafor is 71 years old," Marcus continued. "She is a retired school teacher. Every Saturday, without fail, she sets up a display of homemade preserves and baked goods, items she begins preparing the previous Tuesday. Her entire display was destroyed. 6 months of work, gone in seconds." The senator did not react. Natalie did not look up from her phone. "When Miss Okafor approached the vehicle, not in anger, Your Honor, but out of concern, Natalie Caldwell got out of the car, screaming that the vendors had no business being in the road. When Miss Okafor attempted to respond, the defendant struck her across the face with an open hand." He set his notes down. "Miss Okafor suffered a fractured cheekbone and a torn rotator cuff from the fall that followed. She spent 4 days in the hospital." He looked up. "A bystander recorded 15 seconds of footage, Your Honor. It leaves no room for interpretation." The room was very quiet. I looked at Dorothy Okafor. She was still sitting straight. And across the room, at the defense table, Natalie Caldwell had still not looked up from her phone. That told me everything I needed to know about what the next portion of this morning was going to require. I had been watching Natalie since the moment Marcus Webb began speaking. Not a flinch at the mention of Dorothy's name. Not a shift in posture when the fracture was described. Not a flicker of anything when Marcus said 4 days in the hospital. She was surrounded by 4 attorneys, not public defenders, not local counsel, specialists brought in, the kind who bill in increments that most people in this city will never earn in a month, who carry themselves with the specific confidence of professionals whose clients' problems have a consistent habit of disappearing before trial. They were arranged around Natalie like a perimeter. I asked her how she wished to plead. Her lead attorney, Gerald Ferris, was on his feet before she had drawn a breath to respond. He entered a plea of not guilty on her behalf and immediately pivoted into a motion to suppress the bystander footage on technical grounds. I looked at Gerald Ferris for a long moment. Then I looked past him at his client. Then I looked at Dorothy Okafor in the third row, arm in its sling, watching the defense table with the quiet, undemanding attention of a woman who has simply come here to see whether this room is what it claims to be. I picked up my pen. We were going to find out. I called a 30-minute recess to review the suppression motion. Standard procedure. I expected to return to a room in roughly the same condition I had left it. What I did not expect was the look on Marcus Webb's face when he walked back through that door. I have been on this bench long enough to know what a young prosecutor looks like when he's been shaken by the facts of a case. That was not what I was looking at. This was the face of someone who had just been asked to make a decision he did not expect to have to make today, and who was still in the process of making it. He sat down at his table. He arranged his papers. He did not look at me. I watched him for a moment. Then I leaned into the microphone. Mr. Webb. He looked up. During the recess, did anyone approach you regarding this case? The courtroom, which had been settling back into its seats, went still again. Marcus Webb looked at me. He looked at his papers. He looked at the senator, who was back in the front row with his legs crossed and his expression carefully, deliberately neutral. 4 seconds passed. I counted them. In 30 years, I have learned that 4 seconds of silence from an officer of the court is not nothing. 4 seconds is a decision being made in real time, the kind of decision that determines what kind of person you are going to be, not for this morning, but for the rest of your career, the rest of your life. Then Marcus Webb straightened in his chair. He looked directly at me, and he said, "Yes, Your Honor." Senator Caldwell approached me in the corridor outside the records office. He indicated that if I were to recommend dismissal of the current charges, he could ensure prosecutorial discretion on an unrelated matter currently under review by his office. He paused. 3 people were present in that corridor. I have their names. Nobody in that room moved. I looked at Senator Caldwell. He uncrossed his legs. For the first time since he had walked through my door that morning, the smile was gone. And in that moment, everything that followed became inevitable. I took my glasses off. I set my pen down. I folded my hands on the bench and looked at Senator Victor Caldwell with the complete, unhurried stillness that I reserve for moments when everything that follows is already decided. When the only remaining question is how long it takes everyone else in the room to understand that. What Marcus Webb had just described, on the record, in open session, with the names of 3 witnesses, was not ambiguous. It was attempted bribery of a prosecuting attorney during active court proceedings on courthouse property in a case currently before this bench. There is no version of those facts that requires deliberation. There is only one thing a judge does when those facts are placed before her on the record. I looked at my bailiff, Officer Reyes. He was already watching me. "Senator Caldwell," I said. My voice was not raised. It did not need to be. What Mr. Webb has described on the record before this court constitutes attempted bribery of a court officer and obstruction of justice. It occurred on courthouse property during active proceedings. It has been reported by the prosecutor himself and corroborated by 3 witnesses. I paused for exactly 1 second. "Officer Reyes, place Senator Caldwell under arrest." Reyes moved. The senator's 2 aides stepped back, not toward him, away from him, with the involuntary instinct of people who have just calculated their own exposure and decided that distance is the appropriate response. His personal attorney opened his mouth, produced no sound, and closed it again. The senator stood as the handcuffs closed. I will say this for him. He stood straight, but straightness is not dignity when the handcuffs are real, and everyone in that gallery knew the difference. Officer Reyes walked him toward the door. The senator did not speak. He did not look at his daughter. He looked straight ahead with the expression of a man who had walked into this room as the most powerful person in it and was now leaving it in a way he had not once considered possible. When the doors opened, the gallery turned on him, not with noise, with something colder and more final than noise. Every face in that room watched him go. Not one person looked away. The doors closed behind the senator, and the defense table came apart. Not loudly. Gerald Ferris was too professional for loud, but visibly, the way structures come apart when the load-bearing element is suddenly removed. And Natalie Caldwell, for the first time since she had taken her seat at that table, looked up from her phone. She was looking at the doors. Just the doors. The doors her father had been walked through 30 seconds ago. Her expression was the expression of someone who has just discovered that the floor she has been standing on her entire life is not floor at all. I did not give the defense table time to regroup. "Miss Caldwell," I said, "I am denying bail. You have the financial resources and the international connections to constitute a demonstrated flight risk, and the events of this morning have not given this court reason to extend good faith on that question. I am also ordering your passport seized, pending the conclusion of these proceedings." That was when Natalie began to cry. Not quietly, not with the restrained dignity of someone genuinely sorry for what they have done to another person, but the panicked, disbelieving tears of someone who has never once had to sit with a consequence and has just been informed that sitting with this one is not optional. I watched her for a moment. Then I said, "Miss Caldwell, you are not crying for Dorothy Okafor. You are crying for yourself. Those are two very different things, and this court knows the difference." Natalie's crying had subsided into silence by the time I was ready to deliver the verdict. Not the silence of acceptance, the silence of exhaustion, of a person who has run out of performances and has nothing left to put in their place. Gerald Ferris sat beside her with his hands folded on the table, a man who had arrived this morning with a strategy and was now simply present, which was the most honest thing he had done all day. I straightened the file. I put my glasses back on. "Natalie Caldwell, I find you guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, fleeing the scene of an accident." I let that land. "Here is your sentence. You will serve 2 years in a state correctional facility. You will complete 400 hours of community service upon release, assigned specifically to food banks and community markets, the kinds of places and the kinds of people that you drove through on a Saturday morning without slowing down. You will undergo mandatory psychological evaluation because consequences without understanding produce nothing that lasts. You will compose by hand and without attorney assistance a formal letter of apology to Dorothy Okafor, and you will read it aloud in this courtroom before you are remanded today." I paused. "You will also record an unscripted video statement. No preparation, no legal coaching, no second takes. Taking full and personal responsibility for your actions. That statement will be broadcast across your father's official political platforms and your own social media accounts. The public that watched 15 seconds of footage deserves to hear the full accounting from you directly." Marcus Webb stood. His voice was steady and clear, the voice of someone who had been tested in ways his training did not cover and had passed anyway. He formally requested the passport seizure and the addition of the bribery charge to the active docket, and his hands did not shake once. Then Dorothy Okafor rose from her seat. She stood slowly, with her arm in its sling, and she walked to the center of the room with the unhurried dignity that had been hers since the moment she first sat down. She looked at me. She did not ask for anything more. She did not enumerate what had been taken from her or demand that the record reflect her suffering in greater detail. She said 3 words. She saw me. I looked at Dorothy Okafor. 71 years old, retired school teacher, fractured cheekbone, 4 days in a hospital, 6 months of work destroyed on a Saturday morning. Still standing straight. "You were always visible, Miss Okafor," I said. This room simply made it official. The gavel came down, and for the first time all morning, the silence that followed felt like something had been restored rather than something had been lost. The story didn't end when that gavel came down. In some ways, it was only beginning. 4 people in the gallery had their phones out when Officer Reyes walked Senator Caldwell through those doors. 4 separate angles, 4 simultaneous uploads. And by the time I had signed the remand order and called the session closed, the footage was already moving faster than anyone in his office could contain. 18 million views before midnight. Every major network carried it on their morning broadcast. The image of a 3-term senator in a dark navy suit, American flag pin still on his lapel, being walked out of a courtroom in handcuffs, became the kind of image that people referenced for years when they needed to explain what accountability actually looks like when it arrives without warning. The FBI opened a formal investigation within 48 hours. What they found took 11 months to fully document. A decade of judicial interference, campaign finance fraud totaling tens of millions of dollars, 14 suppressed police reports involving the Caldwell family and their associates, reports that had been buried so completely that several of the officers who filed them had long since assumed they were simply lost. Senator Victor Caldwell was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. He resigned his seat from custody in a letter his attorney released on his behalf. It contained no apology. It did not mention Dorothy Okafor by name. Natalie Caldwell served her sentence. She completed her community service hours at 2 food banks and at the Saturday market on Clement Street, the same market where Dorothy Okafor sets up her display of preserves every weekend. They did not become friends, but they became something. 2 women who share a single morning that altered both of their lives, working out in their own time and in their own way the long, unglamorous distance between damage and repair. Dorothy received hundreds of thousands of dollars in public donations within days of the footage going viral. She did not retire. She expanded. She named her new permanent stall after the morning she walked to the center of a courtroom and said 3 words. Marcus Webb was offered a senior prosecutor position before the year was out. He took it without hesitation. As for me, I looked at the clock at 11:14 that morning, looked at my clerk Michael and said, "Call the next case." It was a parking violation. A confused elderly gentleman who had misread the sign. I waived the fine, wished him a good afternoon, and moved on. The law does not stop for senators. It certainly doesn't stop for me. I have thought about that morning many times since the gavel came down, and I want to say something directly to everyone watching this, because I think it deserves to be said plainly. This story is not about hating the powerful. It is not about politics or party or which side of any aisle you stand on. It is about one question, a simple question that this bench has to answer every single morning it opens its doors. Is the law the same for everyone? Not almost everyone, not everyone except the people with the flag pins and the presidential ambitions and the attorneys who fly in with matching briefcases. Everyone. The moment that answer becomes conditional, the moment we start deciding that certain titles make certain people exempt, we stop being a court. We become something else entirely, something that serves power instead of checking it. Dorothy Okafor walked to the center of my courtroom and said 3 words. She saw me. That is what this bench is for. Not for the senator, for her. For the teacher at the Saturday market. For the young prosecutor with the unsteady hands who stood up anyway. For every person who walks through that door, hoping that the room they are entering is exactly what it claims to be. I have sat in this chair for more than 30 years. I will be here tomorrow, and the law, the real law, will be here with me. Nobody is above it, not in this courtroom. If this story stayed with you, if it made you believe, even for a moment, that justice is still real and still worth defending, stay close. There are more cases worth telling. I'll be right here.